Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome to the Open Door. We are open to your calls, open to the leading of the Holy Spirit, and open, hopefully, to one another and our points of view. I'll open with a short word of prayer and then introduce our guests. Dear Heavenly Father, my Lord and my God, I just pray that you would use this conversation and this time to bless your people who are tuning in to listen, as well as blessing our guests, and because I'm greedy, also myself. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
For our regular listeners, our regular attenders are not able to join us. Jim has had to excuse himself, as has our regular recurring guest, Jack Quirk, and I hear that there is some hope that John Breen will be joining us, but he hasn't. Welcome. Glad you're able to make it. The two guests that we also have on the line already are Amar Patel, who is a teacher in Chicago, if I have that correct, and also
in a suburb.
A suburb of Chicago, okay.
Correct.
And a newly elected member of the American Solidarity Party National Committee. Our other guest that is already on the line is Chuck, and he is the city attorney for Sheboygan and one of the members of the National Committee that just ended their term. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us. And
thanks, Matt.
Just as a little teaser going out there for, some people who have listened before, Desmond Silvera may join us. He hasn't called in yet, but he said he might be able to make it work. I know he's a fan favorite. So thank you all very much for being here this morning. And John, just to get a little update, how has life been since you finished your schooling?
It was good. I was gone the last 2 weeks. Last week I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, attending Acton University, which is a 4-day conference there put on by the Acton Institute. And the Institute itself is basically a think tank in the world of economics. So that was one of my interests in school. So I basically just attended this conference, and there are over 130 lectures to choose from. And a couple well-known speakers were there. Peter Kreeft, whom some people may recognize, he gave a speech there, which I attended a different one at that time, so I missed that one. And also Dr. Scott Hahn, so he was there as well. So it was pretty...
Sounds like a fun time.
Yeah, well, there was over 1,100 people there from all over the world. I think over 60 countries were represented, and people of all different faiths and creeds were there. So it was a great time to get to meet other people and discuss economics and talk about a free society, essentially.
Wonderful. Amar, I hope that I was fairly accurate in that ever so brief intro. Would you mind letting our listeners know a little bit more about you as a first-time guest of the show?
Sure. So I'm a math teacher. As you said, I teach in the Chicago suburbs. I've been teaching for 20 years. I actually got my 20-year recognition pin this year. I teach AP statistics, multivariable calculus through the University of Illinois, and computer science. So I get all the great kids. People, sometimes you hear teachers who have a tough workload. I can't complain. With my kids, they all are very motivated. They're go-getters. They want to be in school. So that's, I love my job, and it's very rewarding. My wife and I have been married now it'll be 21 years in August. We have 2 kids. She's also a teacher. So we have summers off together. She actually was at a conference all week in Atlanta, so she's coming home today. And so our two kids will both be in high school, and getting ready for college. And so, life is good right now. Actually, one of the jokes my wife and I shared on Sunday night, when I found out the election results, was like, oh, I guess, well, there goes my summer vacation. Because I'm like, there's work that I'm going to need to do, and which is fine, and I have no complaints about that. It's just, it was an observation that came to me very quickly that I'm like, I got stuff to do now, because as a teacher, I have some flexibility in the summer, and so it'll be a different summer this year, to say the least.
Understood. I think that you will rise to the challenge, and congratulations on 20 years. I appreciate your service to our public schools that way.
Thank you.
Chuck Adams, if you wouldn't mind giving a introduction to yourself and your illustrious career and extracurricular activities for our listeners.
Sure. I don't know how illustrious they are, but I'm Chuck Adams. I live in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, right on the edge of Lake Michigan, and I serve as the city attorney for the city of Sheboygan. It's an elected position. I've been the city attorney since 2015. For about 19 years before that, I served as the assistant. Some of the other things that I'm involved in, I heard John Breen talk about being in Grand Rapids recently. I also was in Grand Rapids recently, but for a very different conference. I was part of the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church in North America that met there for a little over a week in June. Also involved with an international relief and development organization by the name of World Renew that does relief and development and justice work around the world. I serve as the U.S. board president for that organization. And in general, I just like being involved in things and staying busy. I have a hard time not being busy, so I'm always filling up my time, just like Amar is talking about. So.
Mm-hmm.
I've known you for, I want to say a little over a year now, Chuck, if that's correct, and I don't recall ever hearing you complain about leisure time.
That's absolutely true. People will say, man, you're busy, and I always say, well, it's better than the alternative.
Fair enough. This week we do want to at least touch on, although I'm grieved to deprive some of our more regular contributors of the opportunity, but I do want to at least touch on our ongoing series with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights during the 70th year anniversary of it. We're going to be looking at Articles 13 through 15 today, especially in light of news that has been coming out with the Supreme Court ruling on the travel bans and what's been going on our southern border. I feel like this is going to be a particularly poignant section of articles. And to remind those calling in that the phone number is 515-604-9344. And once you call in, you'll want to use the access code 914121. And we look forward to any calls, questions, or statements. To get us off in the first part of this show, I'll go ahead and read Articles 13 through 15. Article 13 starts with, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Article 14, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy other countries' asylum from persecution. This right may not be invoked in the case of prosecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes or from acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Article 15, everyone has the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality. Now, I know that's some heavy material there, so I want to first take a look at that first section of Article 13, and I'll start with John. Any thoughts, any objections that you can think of that any country in the world today would have to everyone having the right of freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state? I know that you used to need traveling papers back in the Soviet times, but I can't think of many examples of restricted travel within the state these days.
No, certainly not within the state, but what we're seeing here in the United States, and also what's going on in Europe, is that there's mass immigration, with countries like on the Mediterranean, such as Italy, for instance. They're receiving boatloads and boatloads of people from Africa who are basically fleeing their country, fleeing the persecution going on there, or at least that's what I'm gathering that it is, basically persecution. Our media is not really good at covering instances like that, what's going on in other parts of the world, since they're focusing on what's mostly been going on within this country. But it is a real issue, and it's an issue that Pope Francis has made more than once mention about it. So it's a big issue there, because some countries they feel like they're filling their quota on how many people they can take in and how many they can financially support and integrate into the population. So it's not just a matter of immigration that we have here. It's also how to integrate immigrants into the general population. So as far as freedom of movement, it should be a no-brainer, but a lot of people they're separating, or actually they're trying to conflict immigration with national security and thinking that the two are clashing against each other, when with some work and some understanding on both sides, the two can complement each other.
And just as a heads up to you and our other guests, when we get down into Article 14, one of the questions I do intend to ask is, what is the difference between an asylum seeker versus a refugee? As I think that is pertinent to some of the things going on today. But I do want to give Chuck Adams a chance to enlighten us of any historical or current cases where he's aware of complications of freedom of movement within a national state.
Well, I'm aware of a couple of different situations, and they're different. They're in different ways. Obviously, the political situation in Nicaragua raises a lot of concerns. And what's happening in Nicaragua is that the government isn't necessarily taking official action, but they are supporting these sort of militia organizations that are setting up roadblocks and keeping people from moving freely around the country as a way of quelling the people who are protesting against some of the government actions. And I know the Catholic Church has been very involved in attempting to negotiate a settlement to that situation in Nicaragua, but it has gotten very bad. I know of a number of people who live and work in Nicaragua, including my cousin, and people are just simply not able to travel within Nicaragua right now to do many of the basic things of life, getting food and getting to work. And so that's a problem. I think we're also seeing in a country like Myanmar, the Rohingya, many of whom have now left Myanmar and are in Bangladesh, but even those who remain in Myanmar are not being permitted to travel freely within their country, and those who have left are not being allowed to return back from Bangladesh. And really the Rohingya issue, I think all of these articles plays a large role in what's going on there, and is really something Absolutely. That we need to be paying more attention to in the U.S.
I will admit to having not been aware of the situation in Nicaragua, but I have been following the issue with the Rohingya a lot. It's just heartbreaking. Thank you for bringing it up. Amar, is there any ongoing situation weighing on your heart or historical case that might inform our conversation that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I would say that I haven't followed it very recently, but one of the being Indian, I hear a lot of Indian politics really through my family. I mean, that's what they do when they get together, just kind of talk about different politics. And the whole Hindu-Muslim conflicts, and while there isn't like this at the state level, the state militia or the police may not be actively involved, you do see certain cultural things that arise where there's lack of freedom of movement. And I think between those two, you have the caste system that is officially prohibited, but it's especially in rural regions, it's very much in effect. And as it is in the rest of the world, the weakest are often unheard or unseen, and the untouchables, who are generally Christian converts sitting to the poorest of the poor, and the only hope they have is their faith. Their rights are often, especially of like kind of leaving wherever they're at, are often trampled, and not by the state in force, but more just by local activity, I guess I would say.
So it seems like one of the larger problems afflicting this particular ideal in the world today is not so much state action to prevent freedom of movement, but a lack of the state protecting the freedom of movement. Mm-hmm. And this time I'll go backwards through the list and ask Amir first. As far as your thoughts, what is the obligation of the state, not just to interfere with the right itself, but to actually protect the right from interference with others?
I definitely think that the obligation is there. And, again, I visited India with my family a couple of years ago. I think a lot of those issues, it's a balance of other state obligations, such as, food or other welfare, and state resources. I think, it comes down to, I don't know if this particular right, even though substantial, is going to have as much play as some other things. And in a place like India, I'm not sure if you've ever had a chance to look at like a Google map of rural India, but it could take you 3 hours to travel like 20 miles through rural India because of the road structures and things like that. So then when you talk about the state's obligation to really do anything in that kind of region, I think it is a logistical nightmare.
And so let me move the question of the state's obligation to protect the freedom of movement within the state onto Chuck, and say if we had a roving gang somewhere here in the United States, particularly trying to police some highway and prevent certain groups of people from moving freely, I don't think the United States government would tolerate that very well. What is your view of the state's obligation to protect the freedom of movement?
Yeah, I think we have to look at the state as being what I call and others call a mediating institution among sort of the other structures in society. And so, very specifically like these bands of roving gangs that we're seeing in Nicaragua, or if something like that happened in the United States, certainly the state has a very important role to play, a law enforcement role in preventing that from happening. But even where it's more structural, like Amar describes in India, or the issues we're seeing in Myanmar and Bangladesh, I do think that as a mediating institution, the role of the state is to ensure that justice is done among these other institutions. And it does have the right then and the obligation to insert itself into those situations and ensure that individuals and communities have their rights protected. And that includes these rights of movement and residence within the borders of each state.
Thank you. John, anything to add?
No, not at the moment.
So I know this is going to hit us right in the eye when it comes to talking about the Rohingya and other various situations. The second part of Article 13 is that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. I know that one of the big human rights complaints against Myanmar is that there's no credible guarantee of the safety of the Rohingya Muslim population returning to the country, returning to their nationality, to the place that they fled. So as far as the right of people to leave a country at any time, and I would say that is barred, like many things in this document. You could use the word, interfered arbitrarily with the right to leave. Of course, if you're convicted of a crime, you don't retain the right to leave the country rather than serve your sentence. But, as far as just being allowed to migrate from your country and then migrate back to it of your own free will, that seems to be a much touchier issue in the world today than moving about within the state. Let me start with Chuck, who was kind enough to bring the Rohingya to mind. What can we as an international community do? And then what can we as the United States or just as private citizens do to support these rights of migration beyond state borders and then returning home?
Yeah, as a
the light bulb.
Yeah, no, it's a hard question to answer because obviously as individuals individually we don't have a lot of impact necessarily. But first of all, we do need to be aware of these situations, and unfortunately, I'm glad to know that you were aware of it, and I know that there is some out in the culture. We know a little bit about what's going on with the Rohingya, but we really need to be on top of these things and understand the real problem that the Rohingya people are facing. They've got a country, Myanmar, that doesn't even recognize that they are even citizens, that they even belong in Myanmar, and then you've got Bangladesh, who accepted these folks but doesn't really want to do anything beyond that and really wants to send them back, and the two countries can't exist. And in essence, you have stateless people who, now that the rainy season has started, are living in really horrendous conditions. One thing that we can do... Say that again?
They are dying. People are dying from these conditions. Yeah,
absolutely. So one thing that we can do is support organizations that are, providing relief to the Rohingya who are working in the camps in Bangladesh. We also need to support organizations that are working for justice in Myanmar as well. And I do think that then the government needs to put some pressure on the Burmese government. It's interesting that Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Prize winner, who for so long was seen as sort of a real hero of human rights, now is has basically come out and said she doesn't care what happens to the Rohingya, and that kind of attitude needs to be decried by our national leaders. We still have a lot of impact in the world as a country, and even just statements against that kind of work the kinds of things that Myanmar is doing work. But obviously, we need to do more than our thoughts and prayers. And even speaking, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and support the organizations that are helping in various different ways, both relief and in justice matters.
Thank you, Chuck. I think that's really well said. I'll endeavor to come up with a couple organizations that people can support, and we'll try to put those on the show's page after it gets posted, today's recording.
That'd be great.
John, anything to add in particular with the right to leave and return to one's own country?
Well, in regards to the the previous statement, the situation in Burma. This is the first I've ever heard about it, so I need to do a bit of research on that. But as far as the right to leave, it's interesting how this article, it says that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, but they didn't put down, they didn't state, for any reason. So, and I kind of wonder if that was left out deliberately, if it's if they take the freedom issue and they just if they're implying something else by leaving that wording out. So so it's basically the freedom to go and to come, basically. But yeah, I really don't. I haven't really thought too deeply into this.
The other side of the coin that you're bringing up is they also specify it as the right to leave any country and return to their own country, but there's no right here given to enter another country for, no reason at all.
True. And there are instances where, especially in some communist countries, I knew at one point with Cuba that you're only allowed to leave and come back between the two countries a certain amount of times, and at that point, that's it. You got to pick what side of the island you're going to be on. So that one there is that's an obvious example which is an infringement on this right here. The thought just came to me. Yeah, when I'm not sure if that's still the case in Cuba, but I know that they had that. And it's probably the situation in Venezuela, if I had to guess. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. Well, it's already hard to get out of the country. And we kind of ran into this when I was in Grand Rapids at this conference there, where there was a person from Venezuela who was detained in his own country overnight because he was trying to come to the U.S. He made it the next day, but he ran into some red tape. And actually one of the keynote speakers who was supposed to be at the Acton conference in Michigan, the Venezuelan government confiscated her passport, and she wasn't able to come. So they Skyped her in instead, with her speech and all that. But yeah, those are examples that where the right to leave and to come back to one's own country are infringed.
I'd like to remind all of our guests that if someone says something particularly interesting, you can feel free to go back and address it during your own comments later on in the show, just as this is an evolving conversation. I want to give Amar the last opportunity to close out our thoughts on Article 13. Any other thoughts related to the freedom of movement within a state or the right to leave and return a country of one's own origin, or leave any country for that matter?
Well, I would say that not specific to that article, but going to what Chuck and John, just to kind of sum that up, I also had not heard about this crisis, and then what Chuck was saying about you have to have people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is and to work towards justice. From an educational perspective, this idea that I didn't know about it, or if you ask the common person on the street, one of the things in the educational system, there isn't really much discussion on the ideas of justice and kind of like world conflict and things like that. I mean, they might come up, but I know in social studies right now the real focus is on like technical writing skills, analysis of documents, and so and really for the purpose of getting people college bound, which I still think that the percentage of people who are going to go to college is less than 50%, whereas the people that need to know about what's going on in the world is at 100%. So there is something to be said that we have to have some avenues of this kind of information, I guess like the triage of what do people really need to know about. And I feel like hearing about this crisis makes me wonder, like, why haven't I heard about this as a person who is on news, or kind of like, reading and following issues. Like, it just hasn't crossed my path, which is interesting, I thought.
Well, and hopefully this show is one of those avenues of
yes.
education that we can be spreading at least to the audience that, our marketing department and God's will has brought to us.
Absolutely.
In Article 14, it goes on to say everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And before I get into the real hard stuff, I'll use a really light and easy question, and I'll throw it right back to you, Amar. What's persecution?
Okay. Ooh, the really easy question. I see.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's one of those things where you could spend all day making a laundry list of ways that you could define persecution, and not get anywhere. We can all sit here and talk about this. I mean, if you look at a very kind of hot topic is the persecution that you. I guess the perceived persecution that we see like on college campuses, where the over sensationalism of the idea of space, where students feel persecuted and need to find avenues of protection, versus someone who is literally dying for either what they believe in or who they are. So I think I'm just going to have to pass and go to. Say it's just too broad of a thing to answer in a blurb.
Fair enough. John, what are your thoughts on, so far in the context of these ongoing conversations we've been having in the UN Declaration of Human Rights? What's a working definition of persecution from your point of view?
I would say that it's persecution would be the active harassment of a group of people based on race, creed, or nationality. That's just be like my simple definition of it, and a rather conservative one for that matter, because it's a broad spectrum. So I would say definitely it's the active harassment of a group of people.
Thank you. Chuck, anything you want to add on that point? Yeah, I agree with what John says, but I would probably add another layer to it. I think one of the things that all humans have as a result of having the image of God within them is the ability and the right to flourish in community. And so when we deny people the right to pursue that human flourishing in community, that's persecution, and we do that in a lot of different ways. We do it, based on race and religion and creed. But we also do it in other ways as well. And so more broadly, that's what I see as persecution: denying the right to pursue human flourishing in community.
Thank you. Now, I knew I set it up for you guys earlier in the show, and so hopefully you've had some time to think about it. And I'll go ahead and preface it with my own thoughts. To my limited understanding, a refugee would be someone fleeing from war, like in Syria, or the economic situation in Venezuela, or a natural disaster. Whereas an asylum seeker would be someone fleeing persecution. So someone who is being targeted because of their ethnic status, because of their religion, because of their community, or their political beliefs. As far as how you gentlemen understand it, do you see a big difference between the treatment of refugees and the treatment of asylum seekers? And what do you see the distinctions between those groups being, as Article 14 seems to really focus in on the asylum seeker as opposed to the refugee? And I'll let you take the first shot at that one, John.
I just did a little surfing on the web here, and I'm came up with Migration Watch UK, and that's kind of where they define asylum seeker versus refugee. Even though the two, it's probably easy to associate the two as one and the same, and treat people is one and the same. That's actually a difference. So I'm quoting here. Asylum seeker means a person who has claimed asylum under the 1951 United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees, on the ground that if he is returned to his country of origin, he has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political belief, or membership of a particular social group. He remains an asylum seeker for so long as his application or an appeal against refusal of his application is pending. The definition is a paraphrase of the statutory definitions of asylum seeker and claim for asylum in Section 94(1) of the Immigration and Asylum Act 1999. So basically, if I'm reading this, if I'm interpreting it correctly, an asylum seeker is as a person who is basically fleeing for his life, and fleeing persecution. Whereas a refugee, and I'm quoting again, is the word used in the convention means an asylum seeker whose application or subsequent appeal against initial refusal has been successful. In its broader context, it may also mean a person fleeing, for example, civil war or natural disaster, and not necessarily fearing persecution as defined by the convention. Such persons may be entitled to humanitarian protection under paragraph 33(9)(c) of the immigration rules. So I'm kind of going on and on here, but basically, I think you're from what I'm reading here, you're an asylum seeker first until you become an official refugee, if I'm reading the language right here.
I will take that as a correction on my understanding of the parlance.
Well, if I can jump in, and from what was quoted there, it seems also that a refugee seems like a temporary status based on, that they were going to go back once the conditions that made them geographically leave, they have no fear of going back. It's just that, they have no fear of going back minus the whatever condition made them leave in the first place. So if there's a war or a drought or an earthquake or something like that, once those conditions have been alleviated, they don't have the persecution fear of going back. They had left for a secondary cause.
Like natural reasons almost?
Yeah. So that the asylum seeker, there's nothing that's going to change that except maybe a change of, political structure or something.
Okay. Well,
I don't know.
That's thoughts that you would like to add in.
Yeah, one thing I did in preparation for today is I went and looked at a couple of articles on sort of the history of these declarations and sort of the arguments that went back and forth. And it's sort of interesting that as these, especially Articles 14 and 15, were being drafted, it was shortly after World War II. So people certainly had in mind the experience of Jews and others in Germany and in Europe. But it was also right after the 1948 war between Israel and the Arab states, and there were certainly Arab refugees to countries throughout the Arab world as a result. And it's interesting to see that it strikes me that a lot of the wording of these documents was affected by those very specific events. And at the time, there perhaps wasn't quite as much a huge conceptual difference between asylum seekers and refugees, and that over the next few years, as they now put these into effect, they developed those differences. I would argue what that means is that at least the basic provisions of the UN Universal Declaration really ought to apply to both sets of categories. How they apply might differ depending on the needs, but in essence, I would argue that at least the basic right to be able to be free from persecution and to be free from conditions that prevent human flourishing, belongs to everyone, regardless of borders. How we carry that out obviously may differ.
Thank you. I do want to keep us moving because the hour flies by whenever we get into these good conversations. I would like you each to briefly touch on how the United States is doing, from your perspective, in our treatment of asylum seekers. And I'll go ahead and start with Amar.
Without really looking at, documentation or some kind of, summary report, I would say in the public eye, like the general public eye, as I would consider myself as not an expert and more of an average observer, the trend right now seems like that it's very, I would say the humanitarian approach to it is superseded by a legalistic approach. And I don't know if that is a cultural issue or if it's, something that I think for expediency, because it's not as and I'm not talking about like the border, I'm talking about like asylum, political asylum, which does apply there, of course, but in general, as like a broad category, it's not something that I'm fully aware of. But I do think from the cases that I just kind of come across that come in the news, it seems like they're trying to get things through the court system as opposed to really taking care of people.
Would you say, and I'm not looking for in-depth, and we won't cite you as a expert per se, but
right.
Just from a PR perspective, how do you think the United States is doing on a public relations front on upholding our commitment through the UN to be humanitarian in our processing of asylum seekers? Do you think we're living up to our obligations, or kind of?
And I would, well, definitely from a PR front. Again, not as an expert, but I guess we can all kind of be experts in PR because we're the ones receiving, that information. That it doesn't look good, right? I mean, I think we're doing a very poor job in PR because there's too many bad stories that come out that could have been dealt with probably in a better way.
And Chuck, what is your perspective with what credentialing you do or don't have on how the United States is living up to its obligations currently?
I really like what Amar said about how sometimes we look at things so legalistically rather than remembering that we are dealing with human beings. We're dealing with people who have the image of God created immediately within them, regardless of their religion, regardless of their race. And while certainly legal issues are important, I'm a lawyer. Of course, legal issues are important. It is really key for us, I think, to remember that as a nation, we have a history of welcoming the stranger. We have a history of understanding that immigrants, are a blessing, not a burden. You'll find that hashtag all over the internet, blessing, not a burden. And we're losing that in our country. And I think if we lose that, we really lose a piece of the heart of who we are as a nation, and we can't do that.
I agree. John, do you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah. I think one of the virtues that we are losing as a nation, which is a part of our heritage, is the virtue of hospitality, of welcoming the stranger, like was just mentioned before. And if you look at other countries, you find that within their culture they're very welcoming, and people will have stories of how open people in other countries are, despite their humble circumstances. They may not have a bunch of money, but they'll share whatever they have, and that's a trait that's been lost in this country. And I'm also, especially amongst my fellow Catholics, that in general there's a temptation to become so focused in on ourselves, our own personal surroundings, our own well-being, that we lose sight of the other person. And it's kind of an opportunity, too, to mention how the use of technology, which can be used to connect us with other people all over the world, where, in fact, it's becoming a tool for our own vanity. So those are kind of my thoughts on the matter, that it's a cultural change that we need, but it also needs to be a change of heart.
Thank you, John. I think I may have heard someone else join the call.
Hi, Matthew. This is Patrick Harris. I was just calling in. I'm afraid I don't know where you are in the discussion on the hour since I've been at my day job, but I just wanted to be available.
Absolutely no problem.
Yeah. So.
Thank you very much for joining us. We just wrapped up Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, and we're about to touch on Article 15 quickly because I want to get around to talking about the party.
Absolutely.
The Rohingya crisis has already been brought up, and there are a few other situations related to Article 15, such as nation states that are relatively close to sea level that we are looking at in the next several years losing their nationality because they're going to lose their geography. And what are we as a global community going to do with stateless individuals in light of Article 15 saying everyone has the right to a nationality, which arguably the Rohingya are being denied, and other populations around the globe that are less well known are also being denied due to various circumstances. And in particular, in regards to the Rohingya, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality, with Bangladesh not really accepting them as new nationals, and Myanmar essentially treating them as if they don't have the rights of a citizen in the first place. This article seems custom-made for the Rohingya crisis. And as far as the previous human rights heroism of the current president of Myanmar that now seems to be falling on its face, I think one of the key things that we need to bring this around to, and I'll use this partially as our segue to the American Solidarity Party, is that part of the idea of solidarity, part of the idea that we need to focus on with these human rights, are that human rights are rights for all of humanity. And that by not caring about the human rights of any group, it diminishes all of us, which is why I was heartbroken to hear that rather than continuing to label for reform, the Trump administration is pulling us out of the Human Rights Council. But I'll just go around real quick and let any of you who feel they have something more to add on this, even though it's been popping into the conversation throughout, to do so, and then we'll quickly try to discuss the results of the election from the American Solidarity Party. So, John, I'll give you a first crack. Anything to add for Article 15?
Sure. We're on the subject of basically stateless people, where everyone has the right to a nationality. But like in practice, though, and I'm thinking back again to the immigration situation in the Mediterranean, like Mediterranean countries, a lot of these people, they're fleeing their countries. A lot of it's for economic reasons as well, but not just for political, it's not exclusively political. It's also for economic, because simply there is no chance of employment or flourishing in the home country. So when they come to these other countries where they're hoping to get their foot in the door, they could easily consider themselves as being stateless or denied a nationality because they feel rejected by their own country, seeing that there's no chance of flourishing there, but yet they're not being acclimated into society, into a new country. So they, in that sense, they can consider themselves stateless to a certain extent. So kind of goes back to my comments earlier that it requires a change of heart and a spirit of hospitality and inclusiveness.
John. Chuck, any last thoughts on these articles?
No. Frankly, I think your summary and John's discussion of it really, does well and explains my view of it as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Amir, last chance before we move on to talking about the party.
No, I'm fine.
And Patrick, I know you came in late, but any thoughts on this section of the UN Declaration before we move on?
I would just say there's a really interesting problem with these kind of human rights provisions, and maybe with human rights in general, that I'm not sure anyone has ever entirely worked out, but is something to think about, which is that you'll notice that everyone has the right to a nationality, but the problem with that in the case of stateless people in particular is that there's no guarantee of a right to any particular nationality, and this is kind of the issue with human rights in general, is that they're intended to be for all humans, irrespective of where they're from or what nation state they belong to, and yet the best guarantee that we've been able to come up with for protecting individual rights are particular governments of particular states. And so that's there's kind of an inherent paradox in that makes it very difficult to come up with solutions that will defend the rights of people who fall outside that framework.
We have about 10 minutes left in the program, and as Patrick has graciously joined us and didn't get a chance to introduce himself at the top of the hour, if you could give yourself a brief introduction and let people know about your victory in winning a seat on the National Committee for the American Solidarity Party, and kind of how the campaign went, and I'll move on through the rest of this.
Sure, absolutely. So for those who don't know me, I'm Patrick Harris. I'm a member of the American Solidarity Party and was recently elected to the National Committee of the ASP along with several new members. There's been something of a upheaval recently in the internal governance of the ASP. We've had a fairly contentious national convention, and I and several other candidates were elected as part of what we called the contract with the ASP, which was a list of ideas that we made to hopefully get past some of the disagreements that have been really hamstringing the party over the last year or so, focusing just on sort of decentralization and trying to work through the kind of ideological polarization that we've seen.
Thank you, Patrick. Amar, what is your perspective on this recent campaign and the state of the party moving forward?
I think Patrick did a very good job of explaining what we on the contract for America, what's contract with the ASP slate, it envisioned. I mean, it was kind of based on that idea that that there were certain issues that we felt we could move past, but actually needed a very clear and direct focus. And subsidiarity definitely is one of them. Decentralization, really allowing people to flourish with the gifts and skills that they have, and not trying to micromanage so much as a national committee, but trying to help coordinate and give authorities to those out there that have passion and skill that can only be multiplied and spread further out.
Thank you. Did I hear the ding of another new caller?
Yes, this is Desmond Silvera.
Welcome, Desmond. I'm sure several of our listeners remember your contributions from the past. Thanks for joining us. As we just heard from the two individuals who won the re-election to or their elections to the National Committee, they were not incumbents. I'll go ahead and throw it over to Desmond to introduce himself and give his perspective on the party moving forward as an incumbent who did not win re-election. Go ahead, Desmond.
Hi. So I have been a member of the National Committee for the past 2 years. I started out in a vice chair role and then transitioned to director of operations. I am very positive about the results. I think that it's a fresh new direction, and I don't think the results were perfect. I do wish that the party as a whole were better represented, that there were among the 9 spots more representation among different areas of people, but I do think that this is a good direction that's going to move us forward. And I congratulate the 7 members that won, including Amar and Patrick on the call.
Thank you. And in the interest of full disclosure, I feel the need to point out to our listeners that Desmond ran a campaign focused on him not wanting to win.
Correct.
Chuck, I think I speak for the the vast majority of the party when I say thank you for all the work that you've done as you came in and joined the party, and are even now helping with the transition and being a voice of reason. What's your perspective on the elections and the party moving forward?
Well, first of all, I would say congratulations to Amar and to Patrick and to the others who won. I also ran a campaign, but I was actually trying to win and didn't. So, I'm disappointed. I'm not going to say that I completely agree with the direction the party seems to be going in. And I, too, wish we would have had, frankly, some representation from all different sides in sort of the disputes that we have in the party. I do think, though, that it's the voice of the party going forward, and I would rather stick around with the party and still have an impact where I think I can have an impact. I'm going to be very involved in my state committee. I'm the chair in Wisconsin, and I plan to stay there and especially be focused on getting candidates, because I think the only way that we get past some of these internal disputes that we're having, which frankly are not that huge, even though they seem so to us, the way to get past them is to actually have candidates that we can all gather around and support and get elected to various positions. So that's my number one goal.
I agree with you entirely, Chuck. I hope that we can move past our internal differences, and I think that when we don't have anything else to do except, worry about fighting among ourselves, then that's the source of conflict. I think once we get more candidates, we're going to be in good shape. And just for the record, I did vote for you, Chuck.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of our prestigious, whether they believe it or not, former and current NC members from the American Solidarity Party for being with us on the show today. And, of course, the now certifiably educated John for being with us as well. Let me just encourage everyone who's been interested in following the American Solidarity Party that, much to the derision of those who disagree with me and the encouragement of those who agree, this pelican has got to fly. This pelican must fly. I think that this is a party that is set to appeal to the moral conscience of America in a way that hasn't happened since the Republicans stood firm and proclaimed that slavery was wrong. I really do believe this is a party that is up and coming and getting better and better every year. And so I encourage you all very much so to join us. I'll be conferring with our guests. I do want to get some resources together for those who are interested to be able to look into more what's going on with Rohingya in particular and some of these humanitarian crises around the world. I know one of the first places I heard about it was Human Rights Watch, so we'll certainly get that link out there. And we're in our last minute, so I just want to close with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, my Lord and my God, we talked about so many hurting people and so many instances where justice is not being sought. I just pray that you would waken the conscience of the governments that you have appointed, O Lord, that we as individuals, and you all for being with us, and the states that are composed of us, would have our consciences awakened, that we would pay attention to this declaration of intent that was the Declaration of Human Rights, and that we would strive to care for one another as fellow travelers and fellow human beings who are made in your image. I thank you for all these guests, Lord. I pray that you would bless the United States of America and bless the American Solidarity Party. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for being with us, both guests and listeners. Until
we hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.